So as the world wonders where the crisis in Ukraine is headed, politics and myth play an ever-prominent role. Could Russia's President Putin be setting up eastern Ukraine for a military incursion disguised as a rescue? He says he's receiving appeals for help from there, and yet, of course, he's the one widely blamed for stoking those fires of discontent. Given his stranglehold on a subservient media, he's receiving wide support at home, but not from everyone. The biggest crowd of anti-Putin protesters since his disputed election 2 years ago took to the streets on Sunday to oppose what's going on in Ukraine and how it's being covered by the Russian media. And an unlikely source of regret? None other than ousted Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. He has said that he now regrets having ever invited Russian troops into Crimea, and he wants to talk to President Putin about giving the province back to Ukraine. Unlikely to happen. But in Russia's parliament, there's just one lone figure who stood against the annexation. He's Ilya Ponomarev, a member of the State Duma, which is the lower house of the Russian parliament. And last month, he was the only lawmaker in the Duma out of more than 440 to vote against Crimea becoming part of Russia. And he joins me now from Moscow. Mr. Ponomarev, thank you very much for joining me. Can I ask you what is going on in the Duma right now and where you think this latest crisis is headed? What is in Putin's mind?
Duma was on a break last week, and only this week our hearings resume. So there were no so many discussions inside the lower house of the parliament. And talking about Putin, he of course needs to continue the policy that he started with Crimea. And that's the general logic. He needs to play tough in front of his constituency, because if he will not, he will be seen as traitor himself. So he needs to escalate the crisis to be seen as a true leader in front of the majority of Russians.
So do you believe there will be another incursion, and do you believe there'll be, a greater war breaking out?
It's very much dependent on how the Ukrainian government would act actually in coming days and weeks. And that's why I'm just back from Kiev. And I was having meetings with several Ukrainian officials trying to explain that it's in their interest to have this whole Ukraine referendum on federalization. All the polls show that the majority of Ukrainians, they oppose federalization of the country, and most likely it would be like 20 to 80% who would say no to the federalization. But that would help to ease the tensions and to reclaim those three runaway territories of Donetsk, Lugansk and Kharkov, who are now demanding this federalization.
So you say you're advising them to call Putin's bluff, which actually you just heard Ambassador Sergeyev said that they are talking about referendum in this regard.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to hear, because when I arrived to Kiev on just Friday last week, there was a very firm no to any kind of referendums. Today, the acting president of Ukraine, Mr. Turchinov, announced that he agrees to this referendum, if it would be a whole Ukrainian referendum. That's exactly my proposition. So I think that can be the way out of the crisis.
Mm-hmm. So if that is the way out of the crisis, what then do you think is the effect on President Putin if the NATO commander, or rather the NATO governments, announce this week that they are prepared to step up not just sanctions, but to step up also military exercises and the kind of deterrence that many people are calling for?
My opinion that in the best interest of both Ukrainian, Russian and European nations is to keep NATO as far from Ukraine as possible, because any interference of foreign military forces would polarize the society in Ukraine even more. And if NATO would come to Ukraine, then it's 100% guarantee that eastern regions would separate, and most likely it would be not just those three regions, but it would spread to other provinces which are also dominated by Russian-speaking society, and they're very strongly anti-NATO.
Right. Of course, nobody's talking about NATO going into Ukraine. It was just proposed that there may be military exercises with members of NATO, such as the Baltic states. But let me move on a little bit and ask you...
That doesn't matter.
Yeah?
That doesn't matter because it's seen as an evidence that the whole story in Kiev has been provoked by foreign nations. And that's exactly the propaganda that Putin is trying to carry through the controlled media. That we saw the coup in Kiev, that the current authorities in Kiev, they are fascists who are being manipulated by United States and European Union, sponsored by them, and that Russians are actually liberators, that we are not aggressors, that we are liberators who help to free our brother Ukrainians, not Russians, by the way, Ukrainians, from fascist aggression.
Right. Certainly, as you say, that is the propaganda that's being spread about, and obviously being spread about by the Russian media, and they've closed off a lot of independent media inside Ukraine. We know that, and we've seen that. So what do you think the effect of the anti-Putin, anti-state media protests that we saw in Moscow this weekend? Will they have any effect at all?
Frankly speaking, I don't think so. I think that Russian opposition by the whole story in Ukraine is very much alienated with the rest of the society. It's actually a tiny portion of people in Moscow who, yes, they are very mobilized and they are on the streets and they protesting and they are very honest and devoted people. But again, the overwhelming majority of Russians, they think that Ukraine is in trouble. We have a lot of relatives in Ukraine, and Russians think that we need to help them to fight against fascism. That's exactly the emotion of the majority of Russian population.
Given that fact, how have you been treated, and what do you think will be the consequences of your lone vote back in March against the annexation of Crimea?
Currently, we are being labeled, and I myself personally been labeled as a traitor, as a representative of fifth column, you know, as a person who works for the West, as a foreign agent, and, you know, whatever you can call it. But I think that the history would tell. And it's now a question whether we would be able to play down this crisis, and whether we will be able to avoid the war, whether we will be able to avoid the bloodshed. That's the most important thing to do. And if we will be successful in this, then we'll see how it turns out.
Ilya Ponomarev, thank you very much indeed for joining us, member of the Duma in Russia. Thanks so much.